My friend and colleague Karen Ellis at La Cañada United Methodist Church recently pointed me to a story about the early use of vaccinations in this country. It can be traced back to 1721 in Boston. I never imagined that vaccinations were something that happened so long ago. If you go in Boston, if you go just outside to the adjacent community of Brookline, you may find there the gravestone of Dr. Zabdiel Boylston. And there it notes that he is credited with being the person who first introduced inoculation to prevent smallpox into the American colonies. But that was not something that he just thought up on his own. A lot of the credit goes to someone whose grave we have no idea where it might be. There is no marker on it. The story begins perhaps 15 years earlier, 1706. And the congregation of North Church in Boston, a venerable congregation, even in that young city, was pastored by a person you may have heard of before, Cotton Mather. And the congregation sought to express some appreciation for their pastor, and as difficult as this may be to hear, in 1706, they thought an appropriate way to give appreciation to their pastor was to gift him with a slave. So a boy who had been kidnapped in West Africa and brought to the slave market in Boston was given to Cotton Mather. And Cotton Mather gave him a name. He called him Onesimus. Onesimus being the name of the slave that's the central character in Paul's letter to Philemon in the New Testament. Smallpox was an ever-present danger in the colonies. In the first 75 years of Boston's existence, smallpox had ravaged the city 5 times. One of the things people knew about smallpox was that if a person had contracted the disease and survived, then they would not catch it again. They were protected from it. So Mather records that he asked his new slave Onesimus if he had had smallpox. This was important to know. I suppose that if you had a slave who was immune now to smallpox, that was a more valuable asset. But Onesimus gave him a strange answer. He looked at him and he said, "Yes and no." And then Onesimus explained that among his people in his homeland of West Africa, there was a practice which later people would call variolation. It involved taking pus from the sore of someone who had an active case of smallpox and making a cut in the arm of a healthy person and putting a little bit of that pus directly into that cut. And what usually resulted from this was that the person would get a mild case of smallpox and then would be immune from the disease for the rest of their lives. This was a practice in Africa at the time. Later, they would find it was also being done in the Middle East and parts of Asia, but people in England, people in the colonies knew nothing of it. In time, Mather became convinced of the veracity and the efficacy of Onesimus's testimony, but he had difficulty convincing others. He did convince Dr. Boylston. So in 1721 now, 15 years later, smallpox comes again for the 6th time to Boston. And half of the population, 11,000 people contracted the disease. Cotton Mather and Zabdiel Boylston, using the testimony of Onesimus, try to convince the people of the value of inoculation. But the people are not in the mood to hear it. They ridicule them. They attack them violently. Is this some kind of a plot which the Africans have co-opted you to participate in to damage the people of the colonies? Well, Dr. Boylston was able to convince and inoculate just 280 people. And of those 280 people, 6 of them died. That works out to about 2%. Whereas the 11,000 people in Boston who contracted smallpox, 14% of them died, something over 1,500 people. So these results were carefully documented. They were put in a pamphlet. Eventually it would come to the knowledge, that publication came to the knowledge of the Royal Medical Academy in London. And then go forward another 75 years, and there's an English physician by the name of Edward Jenner, who, based upon this information, which was brought to light because of the testimony of Onesimus, whose real name we'll never know, Edward Jenner develops a safe and effective vaccine for smallpox using a less virulent strain called cowpox. The adoption of this healing knowledge is connected with overcoming prejudice and fear. Pride is our downfall. Humility, which embraces diversity, is our hope.